Hello there and a very good morning to everyone. My name is Noelle Connell and I'm the Executive Director of European Movement Ireland. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone in attendance for this morning's European Movement Ireland special in-studio webinar, A Summer Like No Other for the European Union. Today we are very fortunate to be joined by our guest speakers and European Movement Ireland distinguished board members, Ms. Catherine Day, former Secretary-General of the European Commission, and Mr. Rory Montgomery, former Second Secretary-General at the Department of Foreign Affairs and former Permanent Representative of Ireland to the EU. Furthermore, we are delighted to have Professor Gavin Barrett of the UCD Sutherland School of Law as our moderator for today's event. I'd like to thank Catherine, Rory and Gavin for so generously giving of their time to be with us this morning to discuss vital issues for Ireland and the EU. And I do hope that our in-studio webinar today proves an informative and useful discussion on some of the key issues that will impact Ireland and the immediate future, because as we all know, it is certainly a busy time in Irish-EU relations. Before we kick off proceedings, I'd like to offer a few words of background on European Movement Ireland. Our core purpose is to strengthen the connections between Ireland and Europe, and we do this to increase awareness and understanding of European issues by acting as a bridge between Ireland and Europe. And since 1954, for over 65 years, we have achieved these aims through publications, programmes, outreach, engagement, and events such as this, making us Ireland's longest established not-for-profit membership organisation dedicated exclusively to European issues. So today's webinar is one of many that we have held in light of the circumstances we are currently living through, particularly since March. You can, of course, watch and listen back to all of our previous webinars and indeed our Just the Chats podcast series on our website through our newly launched European Movement Ireland player, our EMI player, such as our briefing event last week on Germany's presidency of the Council of the EU with Ambassador Dijke Potzel and our new Minister for European for European Affairs, Thomas Byrne, on what was his first public address as Minister. Indeed, like many organisations in Ireland and across Europe, this is a challenging time for us in European Movement Ireland as we continue to work to strengthen and develop the connection between Ireland, the EU and Europe. Your support in that regard is more important to us than ever. We are a membership-based organisation and membership is central to our remit, to who we are and to what we do. Whether you're an individual, a company, a business, an organisation, you can join us and become a member of EM Ireland today and reap the wide range of benefits associated with becoming a member. You'll get access to our briefings, our insights, event invitations before anyone else, and have access to EM Ireland's network of thinkers, policymakers, while also supporting European Movement Ireland and the development of Irish-EU relations over uncertain and challenging times ahead. Our wide range of membership plans are available, of course, with all information on our website, or don't hesitate to get in touch by email to info@europeanmovement.ie. It is the support of you, our members, that enables us, through our work, to engage with the public on European issues and to promote and strengthen Ireland's place in Europe. So today I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Rory and Catherine. We're going to be discussing some of the big political and policy challenges facing the EU. This, of course, is something that we regularly do in our Just the Facts publications. And in fact, this week, we looked at the wider European and EU issues that feature in Ireland's new programme for government. Today's webinar, which of course has very much in mind the European Council Summit taking place this coming Friday and Saturday, is focused on the immediate future of the EU, on the internal and external issues that will set the shared EU agenda for the summer months. Between Brexit and COVID, the past 12 months have been complicated and challenging for Europe, and indeed that challenge is set to continue for the time being. A particularly pressing issue, and I'm sure Catherine and Rory will delve into this in further detail, is that of the multi-annual financial framework, the MFF, the EU's budget for recovery. And Europe's economic recovery depends on a comprehensive and robust budgetary framework, one that accommodates all 27 member states. and agreeing on the particulars of that framework on issues including a grant versus loan-based fund, the timeline for that fund, and the repayment of that fund is a task that is a true test to the strength of the Union's solidarity. An equally stringent test of solidarity is to be found in the ongoing discussions on the future relationship between the EU and the UK. From an Irish perspective, the conclusion of these discussions is of crucial importance. And that future relationship between the EU and the UK is critical, but it is far from the only geopolitical concern for Europe. And if we look across the water to the United States, with the current US president saying only last night that the European Union was formed in order to take advantage of the United States, the retreat of the US from multilateralism towards a more isolationist, protectionist policy remit has certainly promoted uncertainty and ignited a renewed interest in European security. With the COVID pandemic deepening external and internal divides, the EU will be forced to address a far less open world, whilst at the same time, in order to re-establish an order of global openness, Europe itself will be forced to be open. And the EU's internal policy will be as important as its external policy. So before Europe can seek to sow solidarity at a global level, it has to secure solidarity at a European level. Through the EU institutions remaining committed to the Green Deal, the pandemic, however, has exacerbated existing concerns related to the green transition and the implementation of environmentally sustainable policies, with a further issue destined to prove contentious being one of migration. For certain member states, a common migration policy is essential. For others, it is a policy destined to promote perhaps disunity, and closing this gap between two disparate policy positions is a priority for the EU. At the heart of these issues, whether internal or external, whether on economic or social policy, are EU citizens, and it is for that reason the communication between the institutions and the citizens of Europe is of paramount importance. The Conference on the Future of Europe, which is something that EM Ireland is working very closely on, it is an attempt to ensure that EU citizens are central to EU policy making as a forum for communication, debate, understanding, and ultimately for democracy itself. Nevertheless, there are concerns that the conference perhaps may be a top-down exercise rather than a bottom-up exercise in genuine inclusivity. In Ireland, we are very familiar with the benefits of citizens' assembly frameworks when it is well executed. And it is important, with the Conference on the Future of Europe delayed to the autumn, that it is open and productive and will be something that we will be looking at very closely. In terms of the running order for today, I will hand over to Professor Gavin Barrett, who's going to lead on chairing the panel discussion with Catherine and Rory and then myself. After our discussion, it will switch back to me for the Q&A session with you, our audience members. So if you haven't already, and we're delighted to see many people have sent in their questions, which Gavin and Catherine and Rory have liaised on, please feel free to drop us an email, events@europeanmovement.ie, or if you're active on the Twitter machine, hashtag EMI Engage and tagging us in at EM Ireland. So we will be able to keep an eye on those and discuss those at the end of the discussion. So thank you again for being with us this morning. It promises to be a hugely interesting and informative and indeed very timely webinar, as all of our webinars are, but maybe perhaps particularly so this week and today with a lot of news going on. And I'm delighted to hand over in the very capable hands of Professor Gavin Barrett. Gavin, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Noelle. Right, let's get straight into it. We're looking at a European Council coming up on the 17th and 18th of July. So what I was going to ask in relation to that, first of all, I always start off with my students by telling them never to mix up the European Council, the Council of the EU and the Council of Europe in their exams. So could I ask perhaps Catherine, just for the benefit of our readers, very quickly just to tell us, what is the European Council? Who's in the room?
Okay, so I think it's important to say that the meeting that's going to take place the day after tomorrow is the first time that the heads of state and government will have met for months. And I think in trying to reach agreement on something as important as the future budget, they need to be in the same room, and only they will be in the same room. So in the European Council, it is only the Prime Minister or the President, depending on the country, but it's only one person. They have no officials with them, no ministers with them. They can have their delegation in the building, but they are locked into the room because they are ultimately the decision makers and they must decide on their own. They will be presided over by Charles Michel, who is the elected president of the European Council for 2.5 years. This will be his first budget experience. But around the table, you will have important players like Chancellor Merkel, who has been through several of these exercises. But she, although it's the German presidency, she does not chair the meeting of the European Council.
Okay, now they're going to be looking at something called the multi-annual financial framework, which is this normally intractable discussion, a bun fight between the member states for money, effectively. And this time they have decided, for better or for worse, to roll up with that the COVID recovery instrument, the Next Generation EU, as it's going to be called. Has that been, a wise thing to do? And will it make getting a deal even more difficult than usual? Or are you optimistic about the chances of getting a positive result out of this European Council?
I think it was a wise decision, because if they were only arguing over the size of the budget, it would be impossible to satisfy, I would say, the needs of the most badly affected member states. I would be reasonably optimistic, maybe in the realm of 70-30, that they will reach agreement, because, as I said, they're meeting in person. A lot of preparation has been done. It's clear that France and Germany are fighting to get agreement. You can see from the statements made by the Italian Prime Minister and others that they're going to agree. For the Commission, this is always a difficult moment, because the Commission does its best to come up with far-reaching policies based on objective criteria. But when they get to this stage in the negotiations, most of those considerations go out the window, and it's a fairly ugly negotiation about how little can I pay in and how much can I get out.
Possibility of a further go if they don't reach agreement on Friday and Saturday. The funny thing is, though, with experience, there tends to be momentum, or there isn't, at a European Council. In other words, people, once the sort of spirit of compromise and the sense that this is the occasion to do the deal takes hold, even the most difficult problems can be overcome. Very often when leaders are tired and anxious to wrap things up. But it's not certain on this occasion, because there are some really difficult issues to be resolved, and issues of a hugely political kind. I think it's fair to say that the MFF, while it's always very hard fought, is usually of interest to insiders and to special interest groups like in Ireland, the IFA, for example. Whereas this will touch on major political questions, which will be of deep concern to a number of the member states. I don't think that Ireland, by the way, will be a troublemaker on this occasion. The fact that there's going to be there's been proposed to be a special Brexit adjustment fund as necessary, and the fact that we'll be able to use the limited funding we get under the Next Generation EU package on a number of other priorities for us will be helpful.
Okay, well, we'll return to the topic of Brexit, I hope, presently. Catherine, if I can go back to you, could you perhaps identify a couple of what you think will be the key issues in the European Council, or the points of contention in this?
Well, apart from the amounts, which will be hard fought over, I think one of the issues is going to be the control, particularly of the new corona pandemic fund. You can see that those who don't want to hand over a lot of money to be paid out in the form of grants, so-called Frugal Four, are arguing very strongly that the programs under which member states would spend that money should be subject to unanimous control even. And I think the Dutch in particular will be fighting that battle. And it's not unrelated to the fact that they have an election next year on St. Patrick's Day. But I think in the end, there will be a compromise. I think the money will not just be handed out with no questions asked. There will be some control, but I would doubt if it's unanimity will be the rule. I think there will be some leeway on that. Another big issue is the whole vexed question of rule of law, particularly relating to Poland and Hungary. And I think that is the most political issue in a way. There, I'm afraid, I fear there will be some kind of a fudge.
One other issue that has been raised is it has been predicted that EU external and development spending is in line to be the biggest loser on this occasion. Would you agree with that?
Unfortunately, in my experience, when the member states, are deciding on the final budget, they tend to be very national. So they look at which are the policies, like the cap and cohesion, that they can have control over spending at home. And so the truly community policies, like development, like external policy, like migration, they tend to be where, if they feel a need to reduce the size of the Commission proposal, that's where they reduce it. And that is, I think, very short-sighted for the relatively small amounts that are involved. But I think if that happens again this time, and I think there is a strong likelihood that it will, what I think will happen is that in a year or two, if the needs are big in those areas, the Commission will come back and they will ask for member states to contribute outside of the budget, like they did for the Migration Fund for Turkey, for example. And if the case is strong enough and the political will is there, then I think additional money will be found. So it's not, if the door closes this time, it doesn't mean it's permanently closed. It just means it's a lot more difficult to raise funding at EU level outside of the MFF framework.
Okay, and one last question in relation to this before we move on. Rory, do you think combining the intractable discussions sometimes on the MFF and the discussions on the recovery instrument, was that the right way to deal with COVID, do you think?
Well, I think it was the only way in the end, because as you remember, there was a debate in March and April about so-called corona bonds, and it was clear that they would not fly with Germany and with the more frugal member states. You could argue in a way that this fund, Next Generation EU, is not actually perfectly calibrated to deal with the macroeconomic consequences of COVID. You'd have to wonder about the absorption capacity of some of the member states, their capacity to spend the money, in fact, effectively. But politically, and in particular, once the French and Germans had accepted the logic of rolling the two together, I think it was inevitable. And I think the important thing is to get an agreement on something substantial, even if not perfect. And the one other thing I'd say from a negotiating point of view is that often it's easier to reach an agreement the more elements are on the table.
Okay, well, the topic of agreements and elements being on the table brings us very neatly onto the second question, and that is the question of Brexit and the negotiations in relation to a future deal. Do you think a future, I'm going to ask you, you said a few moments ago you don't like making predictions, so that's a great reason to dive in there and force you to make a prediction. Will a future relationship deal be reached by the end of the year or not, do you think?
Well, despite my reluctance to make predictions on these matters, I am a betting man, but I do tend to lose more bets than I win, it has to be said.
We'll take that into account.
But I think probably yes, because I think it's so patently in the interests of everybody concerned for there to be a deal. That said, I think it'll really depend on whether the British government makes a calculation that it's prepared to make some of the compromises necessary. You could imagine a scenario in which the British government would decide for political reasons that it would suit them to stand up once again against Europe. But I think the issues at stake, whether it's the question of so-called level playing field, and in particular in regard to state aid rules, whether it's in relation to fisheries, I think these things should be eminently soluble if there is the will to do it. But having said that, there is, of course, I think, a strong likelihood that what we actually agree, if we agree something in the autumn, will be incomplete and imperfect. It could well be that you'll need a further so-called implementation period to actually put all the measures required actually in operational place. And it's also, I think, the case that there will be quite a large number of issues which will not have been resolved in what is a rather narrowly focused free trade agreement. So I'm afraid this thing is not going to be over even by the end of the year. A final point is that, of course, of particular importance to Ireland is the question of the protocol on the island of Ireland. Again, I think there has been a welcome engagement by the British government and an acceptance that they have to honour their word, as in the protocol. That's really important for us, both in the interests of Northern Ireland, but also in the interests of our place in the single market. But as I say, I understand from my colleagues in Foreign Affairs that there is still a great deal of detail to be worked through, and time is marching on. I mean, Michael Gove has said he will put concrete proposals on the table this month, which is good, but it'll take time.
Okay. Will Ireland be able to cope with Brexit, with a Brexit in which a free trade agreement will replace what was formerly a single market, a customs union, or indeed with a no deal Brexit, should that come along?
Well, those are two different questions, really. I mean, I think it was clear to us from the very beginning that any Brexit would have negative impact on Ireland, and we've already seen that even in the UK, the cost of additional sort of administrative measures and border controls will be about £700 million. So, undoubtedly, things will be a bit, more convoluted, let's say, for Irish exporters and service providers as well in the event of a Brexit. And the economic forecasts done by people like Copenhagen Economics some years ago showed that even in a relatively benign scenario, and this is not going to be the most benign scenario, there were costs. But if there were no deal, there would be very serious problems for our agricultural sector in particular, because the British have published the tariffs they would impose in the event of no deal. Those would impose huge additional costs on Irish exports of beef and dairy to the UK, our biggest market by a long way, and which would sort of pile further pressure on a sector which is already under pressure and which is so politically and economically and socially important.
Okay. Catherine, if I could turn to you just for one moment on the topic of Brexit and ask, do you think Europe will look back on how Brexit has been handled institutionally by the European Union and regard that as having been a success? Has it done well in terms of dealing with the difficulty of Brexit?
I think the official view will be, yes, that it was handled well. And I do think the fact that the EU has held together is a plus. I also think, in a way, the whole trauma, because it was traumatic for everybody, has had a kind of revitalizing effect on the EU. I don't want to exaggerate that, but it certainly has made a lot of people right across the European Union think again about the value of the EU when you see the loss if you decide to leave. I think that also the classic way of the Commission negotiating on behalf of the Member States has been the only way to handle it. And we saw how long and how fiercely the UK tried to pick off one Member State against another, and it did not succeed. So I think it has shown the value of certain ways of EU behaviour. I think at the back of all of this, there's a great sadness that collectively we didn't manage to convince the British public of what I think almost everybody else across the European Union is convinced of to a greater or lesser extent. And that is that the EU doesn't take anything away from your national identity, but it's a plus, it's an extra. So I think behind even saying it's a success, it's not something that I don't think will be celebrated or enjoyed. I think it will be that sadness will be there. And I would agree with what Rory has said. I think it is possible to have a narrow deal by the end of the year, but I think it's going to take us years after that to work out what is going to be the real long-term relationship between the EU and the United Kingdom.
So we can look forward
and that's only beginning.
So we can look forward to years of negotiation to come.
Well, it may not all be negotiation. Some of it may be about settling down to ways of working. I mean, I give the example in foreign policy, in climate policy, which are international issues that go beyond just the European Union. There you have countries like Norway and Switzerland, which are not part of the EU, but which regularly sign up to EU positions because I think the UK will gradually realise this too. If you're not part of a big bloc, your voice doesn't carry as far or have the same influence. So that might take years to settle down and find the right way of doing it. But I think it will be taking us that time to establish the kind of long-term relationship that we will have with the UK.
Okay, Rory,
Yeah, just to add a couple of points. I think, in a narrow sense, there are ways in which the UK's departure will make life a little easier for the European Union. If the UK, for example, were to be present, if Boris Johnson were to be present on Friday and Saturday at the European Council, I know that the former British ambassador to the EU, Ivan Rogers, said that undoubtedly Britain would veto parts of the package. But in the broader perspective, I mean, the departure of the UK is a big, big loss. And this is a hugely important relationship. It'll be the EU's most important external relationship, I would say, by quite a distance, for all of the reasons we know. And personally, I would have liked, ideally, to see maybe a more strategic and a more imaginative approach to the negotiations, but it takes two to tango. And the reality is that the British government, having for years been unable to come up with a clear vision of what it wanted, and now in the case of the present government, come up with a vision which is not particularly constructive, let's put it that way. That's meant that the EU has had to conduct the negotiations, in a very sort of controlled way, and there hasn't been any scope to explore any wider possibilities which might have been there. But as Catherine says, I mean, let us hope that when the emotions fade, and that it will be possible for the British in particular, but then for the EU in response, to realise that it's in our common interest to do the very most we can together, and not least on the international stage.
Okay. International stage. Great words, because I actually want to move on to the context, if I may, of foreign policy at this stage now. And lots of interesting questions. That raises things like Russia. It raises things like Donald Trump and the US. But before we get to those, just very briefly, Ireland has just won a bit of a diplomatic triumph, of course, a place at the UN Security Council. I just wanted to ask about the interrelationship of that with our EU membership. Will that amplify the voice of the European Union? In other words, how will it combine, or will it combine at all? Should it just be regarded as something entirely separate from Ireland's EU membership?
No, it's not entirely separate. And in fact, one of our selling points in our campaign was precisely that if we were not elected to the Security Council, effectively against Canada, as it turned out, given the departure of the UK, then France would have been the only EU member state on the Security Council. So there's no doubt that our EU partners, I think, rallied to us very, very substantially for that reason, and it gives us an extra perspective, an extra dimension to bring to our conduct at the UN, but also our contribution to the work of the Foreign Affairs Council, the European Council in Brussels. Now, important not to exaggerate. First of all, the UN Security Council is at the moment a deeply dysfunctional body because of the very difficult relationships between the main permanent players, and small member states can make useful contributions, but it's wrong to think that they can somehow transform the international scene in a two-year term. So I think it's certainly useful and valuable, but at the same time we need to be realistic about what we can achieve.
Okay. Now, jumping away from that topic to a different topic, let's look at the USA and the European Union for a moment. Looking at the USA involves looking at the man in the White House, Donald Trump at the moment. Potential second Trump there, the second term there. It's not looking great for him at the moment, but you never know. So how concerned should be the European Union about that? He's often expressed a great deal of antipathy towards the European Union. I think he refers to it as bad as China, only smaller or something like that at times. So will his antipathy towards the European Union have any long-lasting effects on the relationship between the US and the EU? Can it recover from that kind of thing, or should we regard this as a kind of a long-term shift in the USA's attitude to the European Union?
Well, on Donald Trump specifically, I mean, I think there's no doubt that a second term for Trump would be, a serious problem from an EU perspective. Not to mention the perspective of the American people, in my opinion, but they will have to decide for themselves, obviously. I think that there are 2 points to it. I mean, first of all, I think Noelle mentioned his latest comments about how the EU was set up to thwart the United States, which is of course completely the opposite of the truth. The US was a major supporter of European integration, both in the 1940s and 50s, but thereafter. I think there are two issues. I mean, one is the negative and antagonistic, mercantilist, simplistic approach he takes to questions of international trade, and there are already unnecessary tariffs applied to a range of European goods in the row about subsidies to the aircraft industry. But I think more important is the fact that the United States has so immensely stepped back from the multilateral order. It has become discredited internationally through its performance over COVID-19. I mean, I saw an extraordinary opinion poll the other day conducted by the European Council on Foreign Relations, which showed that on average, people were asked who they thought had performed well on the COVID crisis. I think on average about 1% of people in the European Union felt that the Americans had done well. And in fact, a larger number, not a majority, thank goodness, thought that China had done well. So in a way, we have always had a natural affinity with the Americans for all the shortcomings as we might see it of their foreign policy and on occasion. There's been no doubt that we've been fundamentally on the same team, on the side of Western liberal values, market economy, and so on. One final point then, but I think it's fair to say, though, that the US, even under Obama, under George W. Bush, was already, to some extent, I wouldn't say drifting away from Europe, but Europe was falling down its list of priorities. And certainly under Bush, the argument was, well, we've helped you out on Kosovo and Bosnia under Clinton, when we didn't particularly want to, or see why we had to, why you couldn't do it yourselves. And now what can you do for us, essentially? And I think under President Biden, the relationship would be much more harmonious, much more regular, much better mannered, and less dramatic than under Trump. But I think this points to the importance of the European Union, I think, coming to its own view about its position in the world and its geopolitical role, not just in economic terms, but in a whole range of other issues.
Okay, very good. Catherine, you might not remember this, but I brought a bunch of students out. In fact, I'm sure you don't remember it years ago. And I remember you were kind enough to meet us, and you said at the meeting, and I'm off to meet, I think it might have been Gorbachev the next day or something like that. So you're well used to meeting these leaders from your former role. So I just wanted to ask, if I might, your view about the future of the relationship between the EU and Russia. Putin, of course, is getting his constitutional amendment, which can possibly see him hold into power, I think, stretching until 2035. So would you be optimistic, or do you think there's a kind of relationship of antipathy that we're looking at there, stretching on to the future?
Well, I think the EU has always made it plain that it wants to engage meaningfully with Russia, but it has become progressively more difficult because I think we have on one side Trump and the other side Putin, both of whom are anti the EU. And why are they anti the EU? It's because it's a powerful bloc and they don't brook opposition to what they want. So they would far prefer to deal with the 27 individually. But that's of course, one of the many reasons why the EU is good for its member states. I think it's very hard to see how we can repair a relationship with Russia anytime soon, particularly with its kind of Russia first and territorial ambitions. And don't forget, we're still applying sanctions because of the annexation of Crimea. The problems in Ukraine are far from over. This is affecting maybe Europe's eastern border much more than we in Ireland realise. And it does explain some of the reactions and the concerns on the part of our eastern member states in particular. But I also wanted to come to Rory's point, because I think of course, we in Ireland and in the EU would aspire to a better relationship with the United States, but also to try to rebuild a world order that's based on rules. Because what we're seeing at the moment is return to the rule of the strong man. And, Europe, to its cost, has seen the price and where that can lead. So I think we are going to have to be more united internally in order to play a bigger role on the world stage. And in a way, that's what previous US administrations were telling us, as Rory says. But the fact that we had gone down their list of concerns was also because we were coping well with a lot of things ourselves. And I think Europe is going to have, and this is why your question about development aid and funding for external policy is so important. The member states don't see why the EU has to spend on that, but I hope that they will progressively understand that we will have to pay more for external relations. If we want to have a voice in the world that allows us to at least partially influence and shape our own destiny, if we don't stand up and engage, and that means pay as well as making nice speeches, then we will cut off our own ability to influence the way the world is going to be in the future. And I think that would be very detrimental to Europe's more narrow interests as well.
Interesting. Rory, did you want
Yes,
to
I think it's impossible, of course, to talk about this topic without mentioning China. And I think it's fair to say that, over the last number of years, the EU and member states have become increasingly concerned about Chinese sort of economic and trade practices. And there's been a growing sense that we have to be more robust in how we address these problems with the Chinese. But on top of that, you have a situation where the Chinese have become, progressively more assertive, one might even say aggressive, in aspects of their foreign policy. In terms of their internal policies, and you see it most recently in relation to Hong Kong, they are acting in a way which is quite contrary to the international norms the EU would espouse. Last year, the Commission, in a paper, described China as being inter alia a strategic rival, though at the same time saying it was a partner in cooperation on things like climate change. And at a moment when in the US, there seems to be a broad consensus across US policymakers, not just Republican, Democrat as well, that China is a real threat to the preeminence of the United States, which it undoubtedly is. So we're in this difficult position as Europe, feeling, as it were, having quite a lot of interests in common with the US, but at the same time looking to have a more balanced and more subtle approach to China. So one hopes we don't have to make choices of a stark kind, but it further complicates matters. There's no doubt about it.
Okay, well, we could talk, that's an issue we could talk on for a long time to come, but unfortunately, I have to move on to some other issues now. But one perhaps that's linked to very much to international relations, that's the topic of migration. So, Catherine, for those who aren't that familiar with that issue, could you give us some idea of what the European Union's approach to this issue has been since, we'll say, about 2015?
Well, I think nobody would dispute the fact that the EU doesn't have a fully developed migration policy. That's for historic reasons. Justice and Home Affairs traditionally are interior ministry issues, and by even that name of interior, for a long time it wasn't part of EU decision making. It's only since the Treaty of Lisbon that that whole part of public policy comes into the EU sphere. So I'm saying that to explain that, like all policies, it's taking a long time to build. Now, it is being built under external pressure, the pressure of waves of migration. And mentioning 2015, of course, was the big year, 2015, 2016, when we had over 1 million people seeking refuge inside the EU. And one of the many problems when you don't have a policy is that when the pressure points come, they hit some member states more than others. And you can see that with Greece, Italy, Malta. They have been literally the landing point. And they have found relatively little solidarity from other member states. There's a lot of pious talk, and different countries have agreed to take a few more refugees, but there hasn't been the kind of solidarity response that would be needed. And I think it will take another 5 to 10 years to get to a point where we will have a fully fledged migration policy. But the elements are there, they're beginning to come. We have Frontex to help control the borders, the external borders of the Union. We have the European Asylum Support Office, which is currently being chaired, meetings are being chaired by Ireland actually, to help member states on how they deal with asylum seekers. And there is now money in the EU budget, not enough, but there is funding there to help member states defray the costs of treating asylum seekers decently and deciding who gets to stay and who doesn't get to stay. But there's still a lot of different policies. And I think we need to be able to reassure our own citizens that we will control our borders effectively, and that's not true all around the EU. We also need to have much better developed streams of legal migration so that we can decide who comes in and who doesn't. If we could get to that point, we could cut out a lot of the smuggling activity, the people smuggling. If you were able to get on a plane somewhere in Africa and fly in with a visa to work in the European Union. And I think we have to have a conversation with our public, which is that if we want to keep up our living standards as we age as a population and as we have fewer children, a controlled migration policy is going to be the only way of doing it. And I just saw very interesting figures in the paper this morning, looking at the fact that the forecasts now on world population are considerably smaller than people previously thought. But the figure that struck me was that something like over 180 countries out of the 190 plus in the world will not have a fertility rate that will lead to replacement. So maybe by the end of this century, migration will cease to be an issue because it will be a necessity and we will have reached a way of dealing with it. But the EU is a magnet. It's a prosperous, safe, secure part of the world. There are so many pressures in our neighbourhood, from war, but also climate change, hunger, famine, almost everything that can happen. So I think we are going to continue to be a magnet of attracting people who are seeking a better life, who are seeking to escape from misery. And we will have to find a way of dealing with that. So, but I think it will be slow because we're touching now one of the core elements of what it is to be a sovereign state, and that is to decide who gets to come into your country and who doesn't.
Okay. If I could ask you to identify maybe what you think are the main challenges, if you like, or the main difficulties. One that strikes me, for example, is the really dogmatic opposition of the likes of Hungary, for instance, to an EU role in this area, notwithstanding what's already agreed in the treaties.
Yeah.
I think Poland is probably going in the same direction. Some of the Eastern European states seem to really object to Europe having a role in this area.
Well, they have, that's correct. They don't see it as their problem. The migrants are mainly coming in through the south by the sea. And they also have not been used to having migration policies. But it's also, they regard it as a cost that they're being asked to pay for somebody else's problem, which is not a very European way to look at it. The Commission did make a proposal that we would have a key to allocate how many refugees each country would take in order to try to show solidarity with particularly Italy and Greece. And that was rejected by Hungary and Poland. That went to the European Court. They found against them. But there isn't the European Union doesn't have a way to force a country to do things if it sets its mind against it. And that is all part of the debate about European values, adhering to European values. That's what I meant about when I said the rule of law as well in the budget negotiations. There are several member states who would like to tie the money to a return to respect for European values. I fear that will be a casualty of trying to reach agreement, but that issue is not over, and the European Parliament, among others, will continue to lead the fight for finding ways to get member states, particularly at the moment, Poland and Hungary, to adhere to European values. So that's also why it's such a difficult issue. And migration is also being used by populist parties to scare up bogeymen. And we saw it even in the Brexit debate, where free movement inside the EU was completely mixed into migration from third countries. So that's why I think there needs to be a different public debate where I think the politicians are going to have to discuss the fact that migration is good, that we need it, but that it has to be controlled migration, and that we are building the capacity to be able to control those who come in and those who don't, right. to a very large extent anyway.
You've actually mentioned the rule of law now twice in this regard. I think someone once said that every opportunity or every challenge is also an opportunity, but I sometimes feel with the rule of law that Europe is confronted with an insoluble opportunity, as it were. Do you think that the rule of law issue is capable of being solved by Europe? It seems a very, very intractable one.
It can only be solved politically, I think, in the end, because in the European Union, it is largely about a climate of trust. So we remove barriers between each other because we trust that the other partners will respect the deals that we reach. And if they don't respect them, the referee is the Commission and the Court of Justice. But if that breaks down, if countries just flout that, then how do you make it happen? But in my experience, the prime ministers have been extremely reluctant to talk face to face to each other about it. They want the Commission to do it. They want the Parliament to do it. Inside their own political parties, they find it extremely difficult to tackle it. And until they do, and until, you know, the more powerful member states say straight out to Poland and Hungary, this has to stop, this is not acceptable, and we will find ways of, you know, making you choose. I think it's going to be difficult to find a solution. So there has to be a political determination among the leadership for that to be resolved. The rest are, the rules are there, they are clear, but if you kick over the traces all the time, then you need somebody else to come and say enough is enough.
Okay. All right. Well, moving along swiftly as we must. So now for something completely different to a certain extent. I just wanted to have a look at what's called the European Green Deal. Now, just by way of introduction to our listeners, that's a set of policy initiatives by the European Commission, which has the overarching aim of making Europe climate neutral by 2050. I just wanted to ask, how do you feel things stand at the moment in relation to that? Has it been blown off wind, as it were, by the more urgent aim of dealing with COVID-19, or is it still more or less on track?
I don't think it's been blown off course. I think it won't always be to the forefront of the media attention. But the Commission has been developing climate policies for more than 20 years. And I see the Green Deal as part of that. And I think one thing that the European Union is good at is long-term policies. It took more than 20 years to build the single market. It took more than 20 years, and we're not finished yet in building the euro. Climate change, I see in that kind of category, that you have a long-term destination. Now, as you journey towards it, multiple governments will change, policies will change. You'll have a recession, you'll have hopefully good periods as well. And the challenge for the EU is to adapt the policy but not lose sight of the target. And for that reason, these big targets are usually set well into the future. But I think what has changed is public awareness. And I think in more and more parts of Europe, people have come to realize that climate change is real and that we have a responsibility to do something about it. And for that reason, I think that although it will be tweaked, sometimes it will go faster, sometimes slower, I think that that direction is very clearly set, and I don't see it being blown off course. That's not to say that what's proposed today will go through or that it can't be changed. And as we gain experience, we will do more. But I think, you know, as long as we haven't gotten on top of climate change, then I think it will be a permanent part of EU policy, because no member state can solve it on its own. And even the EU on its own can't solve the problem either. We are a declining share of world emissions, but we nonetheless have a big responsibility to not only get our own house in order, but then also to help other countries to find their way to meet the climate targets.
Yeah, at least in the short term, clearly a problem is that different member states and different governments in member states have quite different perspectives. Of course, that can change. I mean, we now have a government which is, you know, committed to really ambitious climate change targets. But if you take Poland as an example, clearly the Poles have been, you know, to some extent compensated / bought off with a transition fund, which is meant to help them wean themselves off coal over a period. Let's see. But of course, Poland is also in the center of the debate on the rule of law, both when it comes to upholding EU decisions and implementing legislation, but also when it comes to its own internal order. And finally, on migration, I couldn't resist thinking, or that I remember once talking to a Polish minister at the height of the migration crisis, and he said, well, why should we take any migrants in? We've had nothing to do with Muslims, he said, since we helped repel them, the Turks, at the gates of Vienna in 1683, to which I felt like saying, well, you were part of the George Bush coalition in Iraq, weren't you? Which was a destabilizing factor. But I think, you know, when it comes to the question of climate change, I think what Catherine says is absolutely right. At the same time, clearly the changes we are all going to have to make are immense. And I don't know if that is yet fully understood. But at the same time, for example, on the point of public awareness, it was very striking that in France, in the recent local elections, the Greens did extraordinarily well. President Macron, in his remarks yesterday on Bastille Day, emphasized a renewed French effort on climate change. So I think over time, as you say, allowing for all of the ups and downs that are likely to occur, we are set on a certain course.
Okay, great. Well, we might move on, if I may, then to the next topic, which is that it has faded somewhat into the background at the present time for various reasons, including COVID, of course. But it's that of the conference on the future of Europe. We haven't, of course, had a treaty amendment in Europe since 2009, or at least a major treaty revision since 2009. So the conference on the future of Europe has faded somewhat into the background. In your views, what is the current standing of the conference? Is it something we should be keeping an eye out to? Is it something that's going to just trundle along quietly in the background? How do you think it's getting on?
Well, I think one needs to take a step back. I mean, there was a period when the European Union in the 90s and in the first decade of the 2000s went through an entire series of treaty revision conferences. And the only one, looking back, which made major policy changes was Maastricht, which was, of course, behind the introduction of the euro and also established a common foreign and security policy. Others have been important too, but not as important. There is a terrible tendency, and I speak as somebody who was very involved in the negotiation of the European Constitutional Treaty in 2004, and also in the final stages of the Lisbon Treaty ratification process. There is a terrible tendency, and this picks up what was said earlier by Noelle, there is a terrible tendency for people to leap in right away to the fine points of treaty change. And that immediately means that not only the discussion becomes unintelligible to the wider public and even to the political classes in most countries, but the outcome as well. In this case, I think it's unfortunate because there are major questions which need to be addressed. We talked about Europe's role in the world, and that has policy implications. We've talked about climate change. You could, despite the result of the Apple case today, you could say that the union's competence in tax and more generally its economic and fiscal capacities are things worth talking about. But unfortunately, this conference has been born essentially out of the rather usual institutional tug of war. President Macron, I think, was in favor of this enterprise for the right reasons, but it was immediately seized upon by the European Parliament in particular. And you've now had this rather undignified squabble between the member states and the Council and the European Parliament. And a lot of decisions have to be made about the precise remit of the conference, who will run it. So it's not a terribly propitious beginning, it has to be said. But at the same time, there are major questions which do need to be talked about, and which could or could not lead to treaty change. I personally think that one cannot indefinitely exclude a treaty change a priori simply because it's hard to ratify change. But the focus should be, first of all, on talking more ambitiously and more openly about what we want the European Union to do. And then if there are consequences, we should draw them from that. But let's see. I wouldn't be too optimistic at the moment that the debate will be as broad, as compelling, and as inclusive as it should be.
Interesting. Okay, Catherine, have you a perspective on that?
I do. I fear this could be a major missed opportunity. Because I agree with Rory on some things. I think it's a killer if this comes in the habitual way about talking about treaty change and procedures. That there's no better way to turn off the public. And I think also if it's captured by the institutions, again, we know what they think. What we don't engage with is discussion with citizens. And that's very difficult. I'm chairing the Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality at the moment, and I can tell you how much effort goes into trying to have a conversation that's meaningful between 100 citizens, and that's in a country that has now got used to that technique. But I think it's fabulous when it works. And I think it involves a degree of trusting your own citizens to be willing to take time out if they are informed and given time to discuss, that they will come to common sense conclusions. And I think after Brexit, the EU really needs to find a way to trust its citizens and talk to them. And talking to them means giving people the information they don't necessarily have, and then challenge them to think, okay, what do I think about this issue? What do I think the EU should do about migration or climate change? Or should it have a better budget? Or should it have a smaller budget? And are there things it shouldn't be involved in? And you might get different answers from across Europe, but we shouldn't be afraid to have that real debate with our citizens. And I think each generation of Europeans has to kind of not reinvent the European Union, but it has to make it its own and put its own stamp on it. And the kind of EU that we have today is both very different and still true to what was set up in 1957. But that's because different generations come and go and say, we want more of this, less of that. But I think after Brexit, when that gauntlet has been thrown down to us, do you see value in being a member of the EU? And are you able to articulate what that value is to you, and what messages do you want to send through your government into the EU decision making? I think that's very important, but I fear it will be a very Brussels-centric debate between the institutions, and that then different member states will organise different kinds of discussions. I mean, Rory refers to President Macron. When he was having his trouble with the Gilets jaunes, he went around the country himself and met in town hall meetings. I don't see every Prime Minister doing that, but in a way the Prime Ministers have to put themselves on the line and say, dear people, you are sending me to Brussels to negotiate on our behalf. I'd like to know what you really think, but we will find a way to not just ask you in an opinion poll, but to equip you with information. Because I remember at the time of both Lisbon votes, a lot of people said, why did nobody tell me? Why did nobody explain? I didn't know. And it is very difficult in the age of social media to get people to give people the information and get them to take the time out to just think about it for a few hours and debate it with others who may have different views and come to a more informed view themselves. So that's why I think this could well be a lost opportunity, and I think that would be a pity, because I think we really need this discussion with our citizenry about what is the EU for and how do we want to shape it in the years to come.
Just if I may again, I mean, again, I agree with Catherine very much. I think we know just how extraordinarily difficult it is to stimulate real discussion among citizens. I mean, this is much of the raison d'etre of the European movement after all, and it does fantastic work. But it's not easy. And even if you did manage to get engagement among national publics, which is a huge challenge, because people tend to think about the European Union only at moments of real crisis or difficulty, how you would then blend those discussions into a European whole. I mean, the Irish public may well have very clear views, again, about tax, which would be very different from the views of the French public about tax. And how do you find any kind of common ground between those? It's very difficult. I mean, I do remember, in terms of energizing people, there was, of course, the series of citizens' dialogues, which Helen McEntee ran, which were very good. But they didn't touch a very large number of people. I do remember when she was giving a report at a European Affairs Cabinet Committee, another minister at the time, who may have been, geographically quite close to her, said rather tartly, were there any normal people there? To which the answer was, yes, there were normal people there. Of course there were. But it's very difficult. Again, another anecdote, I remember well, there was a forum on Europe established in the early 2000s after Nice. And I remember going down to Tullamore to hear Brian Cowan speaking about Europe very well and effectively. There were maybe about 60 or 70 people in the audience. A couple of days later, I went to a local pub, the Goat Grill, where there was a meeting about the future of Leopardstown Racecourse, and there were about 300 people at that. They were incredibly engaged and knowledgeable, So it made me realize just how difficult it can be to get people to talk about what are often seen as rather abstract or remote questions. But at the same time, people complain if they don't feel they're informed. So that's a real problem. But I think we cannot stop trying.
No.
And we have to look for new ways of doing things.
Yeah. And it's not, it is difficult, but that shouldn't be a reason not to do it. It should be a reason to do it because it's difficult. And I think, there are different ways, webinars and all kinds of things that people have suddenly got used to in the last 4 months that they wouldn't have dreamt of participating in before. But I also think, Irish people love debating politics, but I think after the Brexit experience, where everybody has really maybe understood the EU very differently because of being exposed to many facets of it, that this would be a very good time to have a debate here with people. And then you have to also think longer term about how could you bring it into schools or something, the European movement is doing that through the Blue Star initiative. But how do you ensure that people have a regular diet? Otherwise, all they get is the one-liners on Twitter. Oh, the EU is interfering again or whatever. And people, if they don't hear anything else, if they have no context in which to understand that, then they tend to think, okay, yes, that's right, and that's very important. So it's about trying to give people the context and the sense of perspective, because the EU is permanently about compromise. So it's never black and white. And that's one of the things that makes it difficult to explain. But in our daily lives, we all have to compromise all the time. And it's a positive thing. It allows relationships to continue, families to work, countries to work. So why is it a bad thing when it comes to the EU? But you need to have the time to talk it through with people. And that's, I think, the element that we haven't yet factored in to, if we are serious about this and we want the conference to really be based on what people think. And once we've heard what they think, that we're prepared to blend that into what the institutions think. And only then to see, do we need to change the treaty or not? But I think what we need is to be much more confident about what our public think, to really detect better where the political will is, and maybe then at the end to see, do we need a treaty change or not? But in the past, I think I would say what Rory was saying is that there was a whole decade or nearly 20 years of constant treaty change, but that was almost designed to replace a lack of political will, and it doesn't work. You have to have the political will.
Okay, well, that's probably a good note. Thank you very much to you both. We've really ranged far and wide in relation to those questions. So it's been a real treat for me to be able to listen, and I'm sure for all of our listeners to those as well. We're not quite finished yet. What I'm going to do is hand over to Noelle at this stage.
Thanks very much, Gavin. And as we guessed at the start, with such a distinguished panel, the questions have been flowing in. So what I'm going to do is try and group some of them together. And I think, Rory, you mentioned the Apple word first, so not surprising, given that it just was breaking news as we came into the studio this morning. First question is from Naomi O'Leary, Europe correspondent with the Irish Times, and she's just wondering, would the panel have any comments on the Apple tax case, as we know from this morning? And then a follow-on question, perhaps related to that, as part one of our followers on Twitter has asked, what do you, the panel, think will be the implications of the tax decision for the Brexit discussions on the level playing field? So, Rory, do you want to maybe go first on that one?
Sure. I mean, I have to say, first of all, that all I've seen is the headline, and we have to wait and see what the judgment says, and how, in fact, comprehensive it is, and whether it raises any issues which might need to be dealt with. Is it a complete victory, as it were, for Ireland and for Apple, or is it not? And then, of course, will the Commission then decide to appeal it further to the highest court, the European Court of Justice? A couple of very important things to remember. First of all, that this was a case about specific aspects of Ireland's tax treatment of Apple quite a long time ago. It wasn't a sort of a general putting on trial of the Irish corporation tax system. Secondly, the government has done a great deal in the last number of years under Michael Noonan and now Paschal Donoghue to eliminate loopholes in our corporation tax system. So that's important to note as well, and I think it is widely understood. That said, and I think it has to be said as well, that this result today is actually says a lot about the decision of the government to proceed with the appeal, and also to the quality of the legal advice it will have received from the Attorney General's office, from within the Department of Finance, and otherwise. Of course, there is the question of whether we could have been doing with the 13 billion euro, but that's another day's work, perhaps. But I think overall, the tax question is not going away very clearly. I think the Commission even today is bringing forward a range of new proposals in the tax area. We'll see how far they go, how successful they will be. And I do think that whereas the argument up to 7 or 8 years ago used to be about Ireland's corporation tax rate, and I would say in parenthesis that in fact a recent study showed that our effective tax rate is actually extremely close to the headline rate, which isn't the case in many other countries. I should say that the focus of the last 6 or 7 years has been on the tax policy, the tax treatment of major multinational corporations, many of them American, or most of them American, which makes life more complicated and is a further factor in the EU-US relationship that we talked about earlier. But I think there is a strong sense that both from an economic point of view, a financial revenue point of view, but also from the point of view of social justice and fairness in society, that these large corporations need to do more to pay their fair share. How that is to be achieved, extraordinarily difficult technically, but I think it's one issue on which there probably is quite a broad political consensus and probably a public consensus in Europe. So I think the challenge for Ireland in the future, it will be how to preserve the elements of our tax system which are really important in attracting investment, while at the same time finding ways, whether in the OECD context or the EU context, to reach compromises with others which can modernize an international tax system which was designed for an era when ships were sailing for weeks from one country to another, and data was not being transferred in the blink of an eye from one continent to another.
Sure. Yeah, I think I saw somebody say on Twitter that for Ireland it was a win-lose. Won the case, but not going to get the billions. Catherine, did you want to come in on that?
Well, I haven't read the judgment either, so but it will be interesting. Let me put it like that, to see whether this ruling puts the issue back into the area where it should be, which is a question of tax policy, not state aid policy. I would imagine that if the Commission has lost the case, it is because the court feels that the Commission didn't sufficiently prove it was a state aid. In other words, it's a general measure. And that puts us back into the realm of unanimity again, of course. And I think there has been tremendous pressure politically across Europe and even inside the Commission for the Commission to tackle this under state aids. The feeling that Ireland was getting away with something or doing something that it shouldn't be. So if that has been hit on the head, I think it does somewhat strengthen Ireland's hand in defending our level of corporate tax, but it doesn't take away the pressure, as Rory has said. It's going to be an ongoing battlefield, but at least it should now be fought on the right battlefield.
And just actually, the questioner asked about Brexit and the link. When President Hollande came to Dublin just after the referendum in 2016, he was asked the question very explicitly, was there a quid pro quo? And he said, il n'y a aucun lien, there is no connection between the two. And I think, to be honest, that remains the case. Yes, there is a broad sense that Ireland has been shown solidarity, and yes, there is an acceptance that Ireland, needs to be a good team player. But I think we are a good team player. I think everybody would accept that in general. So I don't see any particular connection between the two.
But of course, as they say, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. So if a low corporation tax rate is not a state aid, then the UK is also entitled to do it without upsetting the level playing field.
Interesting. And on that, as we move on to that question, we have a very interesting question following on from that, in terms of the level playing field, but also from French Ambassador Stéphane Crouzat is wondering, how confident are you, the panel, about the full implementation on the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland by the end of the year. And Derek Mooney, similar but somewhat different. Rory, I might get you to deal with this question. Is interesting to hear, Rory, that you suggested a very limited Brexit trading deal is possible, if not likely. Would it probably be more of a holding agreement than a real one? So maybe I might get you to couple those questions together.
On the latter point, I wouldn't call it a holding agreement. I'd call it maybe a partial agreement, elements of which will, of course, need implementation and possibly over a bit of time. But there's a whole range of other issues which won't be dealt with, most probably, which will need to be returned to. On the French ambassador's question, and many congratulations on yesterday's Bastille Day. As I said, I think the likelihood is that there can be agreement on the implementation of the protocol with a degree of flexibility on both sides. Now, the amount of flexibility available on the EU side isn't great, but I would have thought that in practical terms, it should be possible to implement the protocol in a way which isn't in practice particularly in your face as far as the unionists are concerned. And again, as the Taoiseach was saying on Sunday on the Andrew Marr programme, I mean, this still has the potential to offer, the best of both worlds to Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland business wants this sorted out quickly. So I would be, reasonably optimistic. But having said that, of course, I mean, Brexit has unleashed all sorts of craziness over the last number of years, and you can never be absolutely certain that rationality and logic will triumph.
Right, and on that, following on from that, from our good friend Pierre-Emmanuel Devaux, the Belgian ambassador to Ireland, similar, Catherine, I might get you to deal with this. It's related to Apple again, but also the digital services tax as part of the proposals for the MFF. We know that it remains a controversial topic. How do you see the future discussion on this? Because Ireland, being one of those member states that want it to be discussed in the broader OECD forum, how do you feel that this area is going to be part of a conversation about the future of Europe, and should it be introduced on that agenda for the Conference of the Future of Europe?
To start with the MFF, that it comes into the MFF domain as a potential own resource for the EU. So rather than raising the funds for the budget by member states paying in, the European Union would have its own resources, one of which could be the proceeds of such a tax if it was ever to come into being. I think the logic of having own resources is very strong, but unfortunately it doesn't appeal at all to the mentality of the member states when they come to negotiate the budget. So I think it's a non-runner for a long time to come in terms of contributing to the EU budget. The issue itself, I think, will not go away. It will have to be discussed. It's one of those issues which doesn't only relate to the European Union. It's much wider, and we already see some kickback from the United States because of French announcements that they would have a digital tax. And it's not helped by the Americans pulling out of these discussions as well. So again, I think it's going to be one of those vexed questions which will require quite a lot of creativity. But certainly, as Rory said earlier, I think there will have to be, the tax rules in a way are still very national. And the world is no longer as national as it was in the age of globalization. And so I don't know what the answer is, but I know that there must be an answer out there that will allow us to broaden tax policy to take in the dimension of globalization. And I think that has to be done. How it's done, I'm glad I don't have the headache of trying to work out.
Glad you're retired. And actually, Gavin, if I might turn to you on that, wearing your professorial constitutional EU law hat, do you have any initial brief appreciated breaking news as we came on air? But
in relation to the digital tax,
or the Apple tax case more broadly.
The Apple tax case.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it did one link that did strike me in relation to the Apple tax case with Brexit was that I think now that case has been decided, I think the ruling in that case wasn't entirely unexpected. I think there was something of an overstretching of the state aids rules really there really, and I think really the debate, the controversy really is more in relation to taxation rather than state aids. I should say the Apple case is not now finished. Inevitably, it is going to be appealed. The amount of money that's involved is so huge that it will be appealed, and it will go to the Court of Justice. So we're not quite finished there, but we're perhaps moving in a direction in which Ireland sees its own interests best protected. I think the broader discussion that will go on in relation to accommodating Ireland's, not just Ireland's, but various other taxation policies within Europe. And I think one link with Brexit there will be that with the departure of the United Kingdom, you have seen the departure of a large state whose views in relation to taxation actually largely corresponded with those of Ireland. So I think that does change not the legal dynamic, but the political dynamic that you're seeing in Europe. So that may well change. In relation to digital taxation, I have a suspicion that Ireland would like to see the matter parked for a little bit until, let's say, a certain election on the other side of the Atlantic takes place, and maybe to see what further developments might take place in relation to US policy in relation to that. I would agree with Catherine that I think own resources in relation to the financing of the European Union, the logic of that I think is indisputable, but the political acceptability, of course, is the
big one. Oh, thank you very much. Well, one final question, and I think a very interesting one. It caught my eye. So apologies to the many other questions we're not going to be able to get to with the time constraints we are under. But Audrey Curmy from IBEC has asked Rory and Catherine to put on your previous hats, if I may. And interestingly, she has asked, what is your experience of best practice by lobbyists, especially compared to other small member states, and for the future? How can Irish industry representatives, but Irish sectoral representation more broadly, continuously build our influence in Brussels? I know that we in European Movement Ireland, we always say Ireland, punches above its weight, and with recently Minister for Finance Paschal Donohoe being elected president of the Eurogroup. If I can, maybe who wants to go first? Catherine, do you want to go first? Wearing from sitting on from the Burlemont side of things, how would you have seen Ireland try and do that? And would you have any top tips? We should be charging actually for this. Go first. Go on.
Well, I think Ireland is already very good at it.
Right.
I think we are sociable. We don't
socially distant now, but go for it. Yeah.
We don't come across as arrogant, so we don't go in demanding that our views be taken into account. We understand as a small country we have to make the case. What I think we will have to do a lot more in the future is to understand the position of what I would loosely call the continental member states, and to work on understanding where they are coming from, so that we could couch whatever proposals we want to make in a way that might buy them in rather than put them off. And I think one of the consequences of Brexit is that we were probably too much in the English-speaking thrall, whether it's the UK or the United States or even Australia and Canada. And we didn't, I don't think, at business level, pay enough attention to the thinking on the continent. And I think the whole game in the future for all the small member states is going to be to network much harder between themselves and to almost come up with pre-compromises, because the difference between saying Ireland wants this or 10 member states wants this is enormous. So it's going to, I'm afraid, require a lot more legwork, a lot more investment, maybe I wouldn't say reading of the non-English speaking media, but I mean tapping into what's going on there in order to understand who can be our allies. And the cast of allies changes from topic to topic. So we basically will need to do a lot more investment in building relations with others. But that's something we're actually very good at.
Okay. Rory?
Yes, I mean, I think understanding, clarity and engagement, I think, are the three watchwords. It was interesting. I was recently, in fact, working with an Irish company about a particular issue it has had. And, thinking back on that experience, which ended up positively, first of all, I think the company took the trouble to really understand what the proposal it was concerned about would achieve, and where the arguments pro and con. Sure. So understanding is the first thing, and there are many ways of understanding, because the European Union is extremely open, in fact, and the Commission, I think I've always found, and people have always found the Commission very happy to talk frankly about what it is that they're aiming to do. So that's the first thing, understanding. Secondly, clarity. Work out in your own mind, what is it that you actually want to achieve? What is the minimum acceptable? What would be a sort of a fallback if you had to take a fallback? And then explain. And when you understand all that, you're in a much better position, it seems to me, to hone your message in a way which is understandable and attractive. And finally, then engagement. I mean, engagement with the Commission, as I said, engagement with the very many industry federations which exist in Brussels. I mean, I know that IBEC is extraordinarily good already at playing a role in Business Europe, but other companies as well should make sure, because there is effectively an industry body for every conceivable type of business that you can imagine. I used to be amazed in Brussels by all of the people I would run into wearing this hat or that hat. And then finally, really important to engage with the relevant departments in Dublin, but also directly, as you want to, with the permanent representation in Brussels. Sure. I was always absolutely delighted when Irish businesses would come in through my door. Also delighted when multinationals with business in Ireland, investment that would come in. I could explain to them what was happening, and from my angle, they could tell me what their issues were. So as I say, understand the issue, be clear in your analysis and in your presentation, and engage with everybody you can. And that complements the kind of thing Catherine was talking about, which is about how individual countries can best advance their interests.
Fantastic. So crucial top insights. That might be a behind the scenes podcast webinar for the autumn. I think we might look at revisiting this topic again. Fantastic. Well, listen, my last, and I'll ask you to be brief on this, but I think it's a good summing up point on which to draw today's in-studio webinar to a conclusion. Some people have commented on Twitter about they found the points that you both made respectively on EU engagement with citizens of particular interest. And people are wondering, where would the panelists like to see the European Union 5 years from now? And what are the big issues that you would like to see tackled in that time? So if you had a wish list casting forward to 5 years' time, what would be the top one or two things that you think the EU could successfully deliver and have achieved at that stage?
Well, I'll go first, maybe three things. To have overcome both the short-term results of the pandemic and have been able to support a return to economic growth and high employment. That's absolutely crucial, I think, first point. Second point is to have got the green agenda kind of further on. It's been existed for quite a number of years, but to be able to build on the proposals by the Commission and to move forward. And the third point I would make is a greater degree of genuinely strategic thinking about where Europe sits in the world, about its relationships with everybody, but above all with the US, China, and Russia, and an honest assessment then of what needs to be done internally, in a whole range of areas to make Europe more effective, more independent, and more resilient.
Well, I'd like to take Rory's three things and add to them. So in addition, I would like to see the EU finally develop a good social policy, a modern social policy. And I actually think the COVID fund, if I can call it that, is a big step down that road. It's a recognition that the EU can't only be very strong and clear on economic issues, that it's there to serve people, and that you need an accompanying social policy. And for too long, we've had a very well-developed economic policy and a very weak social policy. And the second thing I would like is to see us well down the road towards the kind of migration policy I was mentioning, because I think it's a very, very important part of winning ground back from the populists and bringing a lot of Europeans back into the mainstream of understanding. The EU isn't perfect. Most things in life aren't perfect, but it sure as anything is the best possible arrangement for Europe to work out its problems for a long time to come.
Gavin, would you like to add anything to the wish list, the ever-expanding wish list?
My thunder has been stolen because a lot of the issues I would have mentioned have been mentioned there. On the economic front, I'd like to see economic and monetary union develop a bit more. I think fiscal policy in particular needs to be better sorted out. I don't think in the long term Europe can function, if you like, as a wielder of discipline only in the area of fiscal policy. And I think that's one of the reasons I think why an own resources approach needs to be taken. In other words, approach actually that approaches a little bit more closely the approach of federal systems elsewhere in the world, where the federal level, if you like, has its own resources. And I think that would clear up a lot of conflicts that are there. Migration policy as well, and I think somehow, although this is a big wish, somehow resolving the issue of, if you like, the democratic acceptability of the European Union, so that somehow issues with individual European Union policies don't automatically get turned into hostility towards the European Union itself. How you would do that, I don't know, but it is a wish list after all.
It is a wish list, absolutely. A topic for us to perhaps revisit after the summer break. Well, on that note, I might just draw proceedings to a conclusion, and if I may, thank all of our distinguished panel. It's fair to say it's fantastic to have people like Catherine and Rory on the board of European Movement Ireland, but I've particularly enjoyed the conversation and the insights that you have shared today. And these valuable foresights, I think, on topics that we are going to have to address and perhaps look at the wish list for certainly for some time to come. If I could also thank Professor Gavin Barrett for his excellent skills in posing the questions to today's distinguished panel. I'm sure you're between correction of exam scripts, Gavin, so very grateful to you for coming along today, and wish you all the best, I think, for the upcoming academic semester, which I think is going to be different to what we all would have thought.
Certainly will be.
Yeah, in this post in this COVID world. We have, today's in studio webinar was obviously done at a very socially, physically distant, but we're delighted with all the questions and engagement from our audience online, from our members and our stakeholders. So thank you for getting in touch and following us and keeping online. We might be taking a little bit of a non-meteorologically summer break from our schedule of events for a short time. But we'll be back before too long with some upcoming events and webinars. And obviously we've our AGM, we've our European of the Year award event coming down the tracks, and many other exciting developments and our policy briefings. So please do keep in touch. And in the meantime, I want to thank you all for your support and your engagement with us over what has been a summer, I think it's fair to say, like no other. And hopefully we look forward to seeing everyone again, probably in a hybrid manner of virtual and physical for the time being. But in the meantime, please do take care and stay safe. Gur míle mágah and slán go fóill.